Hey guys, so now you have a lecture video for the male reproductive system. You have another one for the female. You have one for the fertilization, and which covers part of the pregnancy. So, but anyways, I'm gonna make here another video lecture for the pregnancy and labor. So we agreed that at fertilization there is an attraction between the sperm and the egg, and the sperm is gonna swim in that direction, helped maybe by progesterone, which acts as a chemoattractant, helped maybe by certain receptors called human olfactory receptor 17, which will be attracted towards the egg. And we agreed that once the sperm head binds to the zona pellucida, it will get excited, but also it will excite the zona pellucida. The specific protein is called ZP3, that's on the zona pellucida, and on the sperm it's called fertilin. We also agreed that this will initiate changes inside the egg. One of the changes is that vesicles that were right at the surface of the ovum will be exocytosed to the zona pellucida, will harden the zona pellucida, will make the ZP3 unavailable, and so therefore no more sperms bind to that location, and that prevents polyspermy. We agreed to that. We also agreed that the first mitosis is fairly easy after you mix the chromosomes from the sperm and the egg, and the reason for that is that we have a pre-made centromere that is provided by the sperm. And keep in mind that the acrosome and the enzymes of the acrosome were important for breaking up the zona pellucida and pushing the layer on, aided by the movements of the flagella. We're going to push the sperm head into the inside of the egg. We agreed to that. Okay, so we also agreed that the fertilized zygote now, or the fertilized egg, is going to start dividing 1 to 2, 2 to 4, and so on, and will make a mass of cell, and we will call that morula. And the morula will start to have a cavity in it, and we call that a blastocyst. We also agreed that the blastocyst will have an outer layer, and we call that the trophoblast. That's an important word here because we're going to need it later. And then we have the inner cell mass, which will provide the actual embryo later on. So here is the blastocyst. This is all together is the blastocyst, but you can see here this is the trophoblast, and the trophoblast that is facing the endometrium is going to develop into something called chorion, and you can see it here. This is the inner cell mass, and the chorion is going to start digging in deeper and deeper, and we call that that will be the future placenta. This is the site of the future placenta. The other part of the placenta belongs to the endometrium itself, and it's going to thicken, and we'll have lots of blood vessels in it, and we will call that decidua. So it is interaction between the endometrium, or now we will call that the decidua, and the trophoblasts. Primarily we will call that the chorion. Now it's thickened and it's sending fingers, and we'll call these fingers chorionic villi. This is the part that will, the chorion is the part that will secrete HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin, and the HCG will replace the LH. So even though the estrogen and the progesterone are rising up in early pregnancy, as we all know, it's not going to matter when you are inhibiting the LH, because the LH at that point is insignificant. We are relying for the maintenance of the corpus luteum on the HCG that is coming from the chorionic villi. So it becomes irrelevant to have the LH or not to have the LH, because we have something stronger, which is HCG. HCG in some cases, in very few cases, is blamed sometimes for some kind of reaction and early morning sickness, which may be attributed to the fact that the woman has never seen HCG before, so it's kind of a reaction to it. But we don't exactly know why the morning sickness exists. But nevertheless, we know where the HCG is coming from. It's coming from the chorionic villi, and the chorionic villi are what used to be the trophoblast, which is part of the blastocyst. We got that. So the embryo now is going to dig itself and will start into development. We are going to fast forward from that point, and we will understand what the placenta does. So the placenta will be formed here, which we agreed there will be combination from or interaction between the decidua. Part of it is the decidua, which is this part, and part of it is trophoblastic part or chorionic part. So it is the interaction between the two of them is what makes the future placenta. Now the placenta will act as the nutrition, because the blood will go there and doesn't go directly to the fetus, instead will be exchanged, kind of a lung situation that we got used to before, where the nutrients will pass from the mother to the fetus, but without the blood actually passing. The placenta will take approximately 12 weeks or so, so it's the first trimester, 3 months, the first 3 months of pregnancy till the placenta is actually well developed. And so, but before that, you are relying on the hormones of, at least for the first couple of months or so, you're relying on estrogen and progesterone that is coming from the corpus luteum. And please keep in mind that the corpus luteum is maintained during pregnancy by the HCG, because the GnRH and the LH will be suppressed by the estrogen and progesterone, whereas HCG, human chorionogonadotropin, is not suppressed. Also, the HCG is the indicator for pregnancy, because a woman will not have HCG unless she is pregnant or unless there is a tumor in some sort of cells, which will also come from the chorion after pregnancy that gives rise to HCG. But in normal situations, you don't have HCG unless you're pregnant. And so a urine test for HCG is what is used for pregnancy tests. Okay, so other hormones other than the HCG, which we agreed it maintains the corpus luteum, and then later on you don't necessarily need it, because and later on in the second and third trimester the placenta is going to secrete its own estrogen, so HCG become also irrelevant at that point. Estrogen and progesterone will be secreted by the placenta, but the estrogen here is a different kind of estrogen. It's called estriol, which is a weak kind of estrogen, but it will help developing the breast, it will help maintaining the uterus, it will therefore sustain the pregnancy, and we will see in a little bit further slides on the estrogen. Progesterone is also needed for sustaining pregnancy. Estrogen will increase, and we'll see that will increase the gap junctions between the myocytes in the uterus, the muscle cells in the uterus, and will increase the receptors for oxytocin on the uterus. So therefore the contraction of the uterus when it comes to birth is going to be a forceful contraction. Progesterone is secreted, it will maintain the normal pregnancy. Progesterone is also converted by the fetal adrenals to cortisol. It's going to be converted by the fetal adrenals to DHEA, dehydroepiandrosterone, and the DHEA will come back into the placenta and will be converted by the placenta to estriol. So this estrogen, the biggest bulk of it, is actually a conversion of the DHEA, especially late in the pregnancy. It's the conversion from the DHEA, the fetal DHEA, to estrogen. Other hormones that are being secreted, ACTH, CRH, GnRH. The important, interesting one is this guy, the human placental lactogen, and so it will act as a prolactin to some extent, but the main function really of it is to increase the sugar level in the mother It's an anti-insulin, so therefore the sugar level in the mother is high, and it will allow the fetus to take all that sugar because the insulin in the baby is fairly significant, and it will build up the body using nutrients, using amino acids, and using glucose. Of course, if the mother has a lot of insulin in her blood, then that will cause her to bury, to hide away the nutrients, and the baby is not, or the fetus is not going to have those. So the human placental lactogen is a very interesting molecule because of this, because it can cause the woman to have, the pregnant woman to have diabetes. We call that gestational diabetes, which is diabetes that happened during pregnancy. So anyhow, here are the functions of progesterone. It primes the uterus for implantation, and later on will sustain the uterus. Progesterone inside the fetus is converted to DHEA, which goes back to the placenta, and that will be converted to estriol. Progesterone is also converted by the fetus to cortisol, which is important thing for the development of the fetus. Also, the cortisol will increase the estrogen making by the placenta, so there is a feedback between the mother and the fetus, and increasing the estrogen synthesis during late pregnancy will increase all the effects of estrogen. Particularly, we're talking about the effects on the uterus. You want the uterus, when it comes to labor, to contract very forcibly, and the reason for that is that you will have, because of this estrogen, because of the high estrogen that is made by the placenta, again it's E3, it's estriol, it is going to increase the oxytocin receptors in the uterus. It is going to increase the gap junctions in the uterus, therefore the contraction will be fairly strong. If you look at the human chorionic gonadotropin, it doesn't really last except for the first 3 months, and this will be important just for maintaining the corpus luteum. Afterwards, the placenta is making its own estrogen and progesterone, so we can really care less about the HCG. It is going to be there, but it's not going to be as high, and we don't really care much for it at that point. That's why also reactions like morning sickness, that's why we think it is related to HCG, because you can see it's only high during the first trimester, and we all know that morning sickness of the pregnancy is highest during early pregnancy, but then it fades away during the second and the third trimester. Okay, so this is just images for the placenta and the developing fetus. This is sac around the fetus. We don't have to remember that, but it's called amniotic sac, so which you can poke through and get sample from the amniotic fluid if you're suspecting some problems with the chromosomes or the DNA of the fetus in a process we call amniocentesis. You may have heard that term before, but we don't have to remember it now. Okay, so certain things will happen in the mother, changes due to pregnancy. The uterus will enlarge, the breast will enlarge. However, it's not going to produce milk. It's just going to produce the capability of making milk. What inhibits the making of milk is the estrogen. So as long as there is high estrogen, it will prime the breast and it's going to make it ready, but it's not going to secrete milk yet. It's just going to be ready for making milk, and that's why the colostrum, the first milk, is only going to come after labor, not before labor. Okay, other things will happen. There will be weight gain. Respiratory activity is increased about 20% because now you have 2 lives instead of 1. Urinary output obviously will increase because you're increasing additional waste from the fetus, and the nutritional requirements will increase, and there will be a slight polyphagia. Oxytocin receptors are increased in the uterus, and that will promote the oxytocin to have a very strong action, and this is caused by the estrogen. The estriol, E3, is what increases the oxytocin. You also have increased gap junctions between the smooth muscles in the uterus. That is also mediated by the estrogen. You're increasing the breast size, and the reason estrogen, prolactin, and human placental lactogen, all of them are increasing the breast size. You're increasing the sugar mobilization, and that will be due to both the growth hormone and HPL. HPL also will increase the sugar mobilization because it's anti-insulin. There is an increased T3 also to cope with increased demand from the baby or the fetus. We don't care about the corpus luteum anymore because there won't be high HCG, so there will be regression of the corpus luteum. The main estrogen here is E3, and the E3 is made at the placenta in part from the DHEA, the fetal DHEA. Does it mean that no other source is available? No, but the placenta is using extra sources when we have tons of DHEA, which tells you that the infant, the fetus, is close to maturity when you're having tons of DHEA coming through. And so that DHEA will be converted very quickly to estrogen by the placenta, which will make the uterus ready for the labor process. So there is back and forth feedback that tells the uterus that the fetus is ready to be delivered, right? And cortisol is also important because it will help the placenta to convert progesterone to estrogen. Cortisol will have its own changes on the fetus. For example, increases the surfactant in the fetus and prepares the fetus for the first breath. Because of the high estrogen, there is an increased chance of hypertension. Because of the water retention, there is an increased chance of hypertension. So sometimes there is a hypertension associated with pregnancy. We call that preeclampsia, and it can lead to some deeper problems with the central nervous system. And if there is some convulsions, we will call that eclampsia, and that's a very serious situation, and sometimes it demands termination of pregnancy if the eclampsia is too severe. Okay. HCG, we think it's important because that we think is the reason for the fetal Leydig cells to start making testosterone. Remember that testosterone was needed for the reproductive tract and also was needed for the external genitalia. So we think the HCG that is being secreted by the placenta is needed for the sexual differentiation to the male. Remember, the default is the female. The adrenal gland is fairly big in the fetus and much even bigger than the kidney. So the DHEA, you can see that it will be very significant. Also the cortisol is significant, and you will see the importance of the cortisol here. Insulin is present, but only in excess when too much glucose is provided, and therefore women who are diabetic and uncontrolled diabetes will have too much sugar, so the baby will make too much insulin and the baby will be overweight. And so overweight newborns, the first thing you think of is was the mother diabetic? Which is something in planning the labor. If the mother is diabetic and the size of the fetus will exceed the birth canal, then it's something to consider, perhaps cesarean section. Cortisol is critical. Where is the cortisol coming from? From the adrenal gland of the fetus, and it is from progesterone, which was being provided from the placenta. And the cortisol will be important for the placenta, but also will be important for the baby itself, for the infant itself. For example, like we said earlier, the surfactant. As I said earlier, the maternal progesterone goes to the fetus and will be converted to cortisol and DHEA. We know that ACTH is high not only from the placenta but also in the fetus in response to the CRH that is coming from the placenta. But the ACTH is also a stress signal, and the fetus being in this confined environment, then there will be more ACTH, and the more the baby or the fetus grows inside the uterus, the more pressure on the head of the baby and or the fetus, and that will cause ACTH to be even more elevated, which will increase the cortisol, which will lead to the increase in the estrogen in the placenta, which will lead to the increase in the oxytocin receptors and the gap junction. So everything feeds back and forth between the placenta and the fetus. At birth, there are certain signals that are coming from the fetus, and that includes the ACTH levels, the cortisol levels, all of these, and the DHEA. All of these are coming back from the fetus to say, okay, we are ready. Also pushing by the head of the fetus on the cervix of the uterus will start dilating and will start reaction in increasing the oxytocin secretion just by the dilation of the cervix. That will start the chain of reactions to for labor. Please remember that the oxytocin receptors have increased significantly in the uterus, so therefore when we start to have elevated oxytocin, slightly elevated oxytocin because of a stretch on the uterus, then the contraction will be very forceful, also aided by the fact that we have gap junctions between the uterine myocytes, and therefore the contraction is also very strong. Okay, so there will be dilation of the cervix, and that's one thing at the clinic or with the midwife will be assessed. That tells an indication of the progression of labor from 1 finger, 2 fingers, 3 fingers, 4 fingers. The diameter of the opening of the cervix will give an indication how the progression is going. Like I said earlier, that the fetal head pushing on the cervix will initiate even more contraction, and stress signals from the fetus like ACTH and increased cortisol that may facilitate the labor. And the very last thing that we kind of need to appreciate is the fact that oxytocin is in fact causes very forceful contraction at birth, which is aided by the fact that we have tons of receptors on the uterus. It's also aided by the fact that we have gap junctions in the uterus. Sometimes we use the synthetic form, the Pitocin, in order to induce labor. We call that Pitocin drip. You may have heard that term before. Okay, we don't have to go through the stages of labor. The only thing that we just need to appreciate is the lactation, that during gestation the breast is getting ready, and we have many hormones that will do that. We have the estrogen, we have the prolactin, we have the HPL, but no milk will be secreted yet, because that milk secretion will be inhibited by the estrogen. Once birth happens, the woman will lose the placenta. The placenta is not there anymore, and therefore no more estrogen suppression, and the milk will start to be initially very little amount. We call that the colostrum, and then later on with the suckling on the nipple there will be a reflex increasing the making of milk, both by increasing the prolactin and increasing the oxytocin secretion, which will squeeze or squirt the milk to the baby. So that was a quick summary of the very last part of our reproductive physiology of the female, which included the pregnancy, labor, and nursing. So I hope now you have all the chapter covered in review videos. I hope that would be helpful for you guys preparing for the exam tomorrow. Have a great day.